The town was quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever happened until he arrived. Ethan had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. The stranger wasn't like anyone else. His presence unsettled the town in ways no one could explain. People whispered about him in hushed tones, but no one dared to confront him. Victor. That was the name people had reluctantly given. No last name, no history, no connections. He had appeared out of nowhere and settled in an old house on the outskirts of town, a place long abandoned and avoided. Ethan, a journalist always chasing the next big story, felt an itch in his mind, an itch he couldn't ignore. Who was Victor? Why did people avoid him? Why did his mere presence cast a shadow over the town? He started asking questions. The grocer shook his head and walked away. The librarian stiffened, suddenly busy with an unrelated task. Even the town's sheriff, usually chatty, simply said, "Let it be, Ethan. Some things don't need digging up." That only made him more determined. One evening, Ethan followed Victor from a distance. The man walked with purpose, but never in a hurry. His dark coat blended into the night, his movements eerily smooth. He never greeted anyone, never stopped anywhere for long. Then something strange happened. Instead of going into his house, Victor stopped in front of it. He stood there for minutes, staring at the door as if waiting for something. The street was empty, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves. Ethan crouched behind a parked car, watching. Victor's head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then, without warning, he turned, eyes locking directly onto where Ethan hid. Ethan's breath caught. It was impossible. The street was dark, he hadn't made a sound. Yet Victor knew. Slowly, almost deliberately, Victor raised a hand and touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before stepping inside the house. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. He had spent years exposing secrets, uncovering lies, revealing truths people wanted buried. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know more. Yet he couldn't walk away.
Not now.
Not when every instinct told him this was bigger than anything he had ever uncovered. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something far bigger than he had anticipated. His gut told him Victor wasn't just a loner passing through town. There was intent behind his presence, and Ethan needed to know why. The next day, he went to the town records office, expecting to find at least some trace of Victor, an old address, a work permit, something. But there was nothing. It was as if the man didn't exist. That only made Ethan more determined. He started watching Victor more closely, tracking his movements. Every night, Victor followed the same routine, disappearing into the woods behind his house, staying there for hours before returning. He never carried anything, never seemed to be searching for anything. He was just there, waiting. Ethan needed proof. One night, when Victor was gone, he broke into the abandoned house. The air inside was thick with dust, but the place wasn't empty. On the walls, strange markings were carved deep into the wood, symbols Ethan didn't recognize. A single candle sat in the center of the room, melted wax hardened into layers. Then he saw the photographs. A stack of them, old and yellowed. They were pictures of people from town, some dating back decades. Faces he recognized, faces that had gone missing over the years. His hands trembled as he picked up a locked metal box resting on a small table. It was heavy, secured with a thick padlock. He was about to search for something to pry it open when he heard footsteps. Victor was back. Ethan barely had time to slip into the shadows as the front door creaked open. Victor walked in, carrying a briefcase. He placed it on the table, his movements eerily methodical. With a quiet click, he opened it. Inside, Ethan saw a gun. Next to it, a folded piece of paper. A list. He squinted, trying to make out the names, and his heart nearly stopped when he recognized a few of them. People who had recently vanished. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just some drifter with a mysterious past. Victor was hunting people, and Ethan had no idea why. Then the floor creaked beneath him. Victor's head snapped up. His eyes went straight to the darkness, where Ethan was hiding. For a moment, there was silence. Then Victor moved. Ethan ran. His breath came in short gasps, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Behind him, Victor moved with terrifying speed, his footsteps impossibly light for a man of his build. Ethan pushed harder, sprinting through the empty streets, cutting through alleyways, desperate to put distance between them. The town was silent. No one to call for help. No doors to knock on. Everyone was asleep, unaware of the danger lurking in their midst. He veered left, heading toward the sheriff's office. If anyone could help, it had to be him. Ethan burst through the door, breathless. The sheriff, half asleep at his desk, jolted upright. "You have to listen to me," Ethan gasped. "Victor, he's not who he says he is. He has a list. People who've disappeared. He's behind it." The sheriff frowned, eyeing Ethan like he was losing his mind. "Slow down. What are you talking about?" "I saw it with my own eyes. The pictures, the names. There's a metal box in his house. He's planning something." The sheriff exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Stay here." Together, they drove to the abandoned house. Ethan's hands were still shaking as they stepped inside. The room looked exactly as he had left it, except the table was empty. The box was gone. The photos were gone. Ethan spun around, his panic rising. "It was here. I swear." The sheriff studied him, his expression unreadable. Then the door creaked. Victor stood in the doorway, calm, composed, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ethan's been under a lot of stress lately," Victor said smoothly. His voice was deep, steady. "Maybe he needs some rest." Ethan's mouth went dry. The sheriff nodded slowly, almost as if he had already made up his mind. "You should go home, Ethan," he said. Ethan couldn't believe it. "You don't understand." "Go home." Victor's eyes never left him, watching, waiting. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He was on his own. That night, back in his apartment, he found a note slipped under his door. "Leave now or you'll be next." His blood ran cold. Victor was 2 steps ahead, and Ethan was running out of time. Ethan didn't sleep. Every sound outside his window made his pulse spike. He knew leaving wasn't an option, not without answers. Victor had erased every trace of evidence, but Ethan still had one thing left: the truth. And he was going to find it. He spent hours digging through old newspapers, searching for anything remotely connected to Victor. That's when he found it, a decades-old article about a classified government program. A project designed to create operatives who could blend into any environment, eliminate threats, and disappear without a trace. No records. No past. Ghosts. Victor wasn't just a drifter. He was one of them. Ethan's hands shook as he scrolled further. The project had been shut down, its agents supposedly decommissioned. But what if some had gone rogue? What if Victor was still following orders? A knock at the door made his breath hitch. Soft. Deliberate. He didn't move. The silence stretched. Then, just as suddenly, the presence outside disappeared. Ethan exhaled sharply. He had to act fast. He grabbed his notes, his laptop, and rushed out the back door, heart pounding. He needed to get his findings out before Victor got to him. At the train station, he mailed everything, copies of his research, notes, and observations, to multiple journalists. If anything happened to him, the truth wouldn't die with him. As he boarded the train, exhaustion weighed on him, but relief was nowhere to be found. He had exposed the truth, but that didn't mean he was safe. As the train pulled away, he glanced out the window. Victor stood on the platform, watching. A slow smirk formed on his lips. Ethan's stomach dropped. The train was moving, but somehow he knew this wasn't over.